Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tane West, and I am a program coordinator with the Alice Paul Institute. We are a nonprofit based out of Alice Paul's childhood home, Paulsdale, in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, where I have the pleasure of joining you from this afternoon. With me, I have Dr. Nadine Rosechild-Sullivan. She is a subject matter expert at the intersections of sexuality, gender, spirituality, race, ethnicity, and social movements. She is a full-time instructor of sociology at Rowan University and a part-time instructor in gender sexuality and women's studies at Temple University. And I am going to go ahead and turn it over to her to give you a better introduction to herself. Thank you so much for being here today with us. And please introduce us a little bit better, Teresa.
Thank you, Tane. And I'm so excited to be here today. I so much appreciate the work of the Alice Paul Institute. And in teaching gender, sexuality, and women's studies, I have been spending the last number of years teaching about the Equal Rights Amendment and showing equal means equal wherever possible. And we had it brought into Rowan last year before COVID, and for a couple of showings, and just really appreciate this group of women, and have been to sit on the porch with you and be part of events. But so I've just published a book called Passing the Baton: Birth Control, Precondition of the Liberation of Women. And I came to the title and to the premise of the book across my lifespan because of what I've lived. So through the years, I've taught, in teaching women's studies, I've often asked students to take out a piece of paper, and I give them a scenario. It's like an in-class writing. You've got 10 minutes to answer this question. And I tell them that for the purposes of this exercise, they are cisgendered and heterosexual, that they are married to their to the love of their life, that they are passionately attracted to each other, and they have no access to birth control. How will they keep themselves from having a baby every year? And then my students stumble and, they try to come up with alternate acts or whatever. But the fact is that I am the oldest daughter and the second birth of my mother, who gave birth from birth to birth was a period of 14 and a half years time, as she gave birth to 13 children in 12 pregnancies. So I was her only set of twins, and my twin brother didn't make it. So of her 12 pregnancies, she had 12 living children, 7 boys and 5 girls. And, and in that 14 and a half year window. And so that was my normal, and I didn't know any differently growing up. But then we were Catholic, and I was in Catholic high school when a tiny little nun by the name of Sister Regina of Jesus brought in some audio tapes. They were big reel-to-reel things that spun from, one reel to the other. But it was a physician giving sex and birth control information. And so my mother had to sign the permission slip, and she told me that she would not sign it unless I came home and told her what they said. So my mom signed this slip, and when I'd come home from Sister Regina of Jesus's class, where she played this recording, my mother would, say, "Tell me what she said." And one of the recordings had dealt with female orgasm, which was a question at that time. And there were all sorts of, whether it was possible or real or should be uterine or clitoral or whatever. And so this physician had said, and when I came home and told my mother what this physician had said about clitoral stimulation, my mother, with her 12th living child on her hip, turned to me and said, "Oh, is that why it happens sometimes and not others?" And I was like, I was TMI, right? And but then also there was another recording in which I came home with birth control information, and hormonal birth control was relatively new at this point. So to the best of my recollection, this would have been either fall 1967 or 68, and when this was happening. And she had my youngest brother, Dion, on her hip. He was born in February 1967. And so she says, I'm telling her what the physician on the recording had said about birth control. And she turns to me again with Dion on her hip, and she says, when the Pope gets pregnant, I'll have another one. And then she didn't have any more. And then it was 6 years before she had her hysterectomy, which was eventually medically necessary. And as she approached 60, 65 years old, she began to agonize. And she started to go around to her 12 living children and their spouses and to beg us not to use birth control, because she would come and she'd say, please don't get your tubes tied. Please don't have a vasectomy. Please don't take the pill. Please don't use condoms. Please don't do, and her whole thing was, she was then feeling guilty that maybe God had wanted to bring 4 to 6 more children into the earth through her in those 6 years. And I was like, aghast. Like, you wanted me to be one of, 16 to 18 children, not 12 living children. It was, overwhelming. But this was the world I grew up in. And so my mother and father were particularly fertile. We did have best friends that had 14 in their family. They were a little further spaced. My mother breastfed every child. And for me, the twin would be, she couldn't do that because I was in the hospital for a month, but she still pumped milk for us. And so she lactated after each pregnancy, and time after time after time, she got pregnant 3 months after giving birth. So that her first 4 pregnancies, she gave birth in July, August, and then July. And then she went a whole year, a whole year and a half instead of a year. Some of us are less than a year apart. And just the overwhelm of that, the number of diapers and bottles and the number of children. And it's, a lot of times through the years, people have been like, oh, it must be really wonderful for you, such a large, warm, loving family. And it's differential, right? The older children overwhelmingly just felt unparented, because she was always pregnant. She always had a nursing newborn. She always had a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old. There was just, you couldn't turn to her for comfort or advice. I was really old enough to be in Sister Regina of Jesus's class before my mother was talking to me much. And in all of that space, she just had so many children. She cooked in pots big enough for an army, and every night's dinner dishes were like, somebody's Thanksgiving or Christmas or holiday meal. And so just that space, but also to realize, like, through the years as I got older, to think about what would have happened if my father had died. What would have happened to us? I've met women in the years since then who's came from situations in which somebody had died and the children had to be farmed out to different relatives. My parents didn't have that many relatives. My father was an only child. My mother was one of 3. We would have gone to orphanage. I don't know what they would have done, in that regard. And also I've met women in the years since who lost jobs the minute they married, or lost jobs the minute they got pregnant. They were maybe 5, 6 years older than me, and they went off. They invited their boss and their coworkers to their wedding and their reception. They went off on their honeymoon, returned, walked in on Monday morning, and the boss was like, "Why are you here? You don't have a job anymore. You're married," or, "We can't have a woman in a family way here." And so through time, I'm teaching on the status of women in the United States and the status of women in third world countries or developing countries, is just to recognize that in spaces where we cannot control our own reproduction, where we can't make choices. My mother's only choice, and the only choice either that her biology was giving her, because she was apparently very fertile, and this was all happening. The pill comes out in 1960, but it's not legal for married women until Griswold versus Connecticut, at least in some states. And so Griswold v. Connecticut is 1965. Well, by then she's fully pregnant. By July, I think it was June of 65, she was almost ready to give birth to her for the 11th time. So the only child she could have prevented sooner in that space would have been the last one. And, so the fact that there was no birth control for her, and then the Catholic Episcopal, the encyclical letter of Pope Paul VI, who wrote Humanae Vitae, came out, and then they felt bound by that initially. But, all of that something of our lives meant that there were no choices, right? And so, my father had a lovely relationship, and they were generally happy. She did tell me that day when she told me about the Pope getting pregnant, she did tell me all 12 of you were rhythm babies. She said, we wanted a number of children. We wanted 6 to 8, but we wanted you further apart. And so there was just, and my father was a physician. He was an osteopath in private practice. And my mother, when her youngest went to high school, after 37 years of underage parenting, really, she went back to college. And she got an RN at 60 years old and graduated second in her class from nursing school. And the woman who graduated first in the class was my sister, Lori. And when they took their nursing boards, Mom beat Lori on the score of the boards. So they were both bright people and cognizant of what was known of human reproduction in the 1950s and 60s. And so certainly knew what to do. It just simply, between their passion for each other, whatever that was, and, and their fertility, it just didn't work for them. And so not having birth control means we don't get to make those choices. And so there's an old movie there's an old documentary PBS had put out called The Pill. And in that movie, a couple of times, the statement is made that early leaders of the birth control movement realized, Sanger and Catherine Dexter McCormick realized that birth control was a precondition of the liberation of women, and it is. Without the ability to control our reproduction, as they say in that film, women are not viewed as self-sustainable economic units, right? And so in a space where we can't tell if I'm going to have, one baby or 20, literally 20, then all that can happen is I must be given in marriage because there must be someone to provide for me and those offspring because I can't reliably do it for myself. And so employers used it and schools used it. Our society was built around it, and other societies are still built around this lack of access to birth control. And so in this time, to wrap up, watching the last few years, I think it's in Equal Means Equal, where there's an older feminist who says, old babes like me thought this was done. We thought at least we knew abortion was always a contest, but we thought that at least contraception, hormonal birth control, was a settled deal. And then with the Affordable Care Act and with the backlash against the Affordable Care Act, suddenly the political conversation began to include again actual contraception, birth control, and then the Hobby Lobby case, and the fact that a privately held corporation, can have a religious perspective and refuse to cover its employees' health care in terms of contraception. Those kinds of things just make it such a frightening time. Hence, passing the baton, because we didn't want it to be this way, but unfortunately, the youngest generation is going to have to take up, not only the cause of the ability to make a choice in the first weeks of the pregnancy, but also the ability to, choose among various methods of choosing when and if. And, and on the other side, reproductive justice also backs having the ability to have whatever help we need to get pregnant when we want to get pregnant. So, so I will wrap up for a moment, but I also, just briefly, my other books I've written, I Trusted You Fully and Honestly, Speaking of Gendered Assault as a Sexual Assault Survivor. So it focuses on the status of women in the United States based on violence against women through domestic violence or interpersonal violence and rape and assault. And then I've written one called An Abomination in the Sight of the Lord, a deeper look at the Jewish and Christian scriptures called to condemn homosexuality, because I did spend 20 some years as a Pentecostal right wing pastor. Um, and so as I was leaving that and coming out to myself again, my sister, who is lesbian, challenged me about what the scriptures actually said about gay people. And so I did some deep diving into the Greek and Hebrew to the best of my ability to look at what those verses actually say. And of course, they do not forbid LGBT people from being. And so, now I'll be quiet. Thank you.
No, that's amazing. And I would love if you would share a little bit more of your personal history, but I have a question too, so we'll go ahead and get to that. Do you know of any data on how many women died as a result of taking the pill in those early years?
So it's not an area that I concentrated on in that old documentary, which I wish they would bring back. I have a bootleg copy from my TiVo, and that I've managed to save as a digital file, but it's not for sale, and I wish it were. But they did deal with the Puerto Rican studies, and they did deal with the amount of hormone that was in those early pills, and the fact that people were having strokes and various issues. And they dealt with the early women's health, like the resistance to it, the congressional hearings where female activists stood up and addressed the senators about, not being heard in regard to birth control. And so, yeah, but I'm sorry, I don't actually know raw numbers or proportional numbers.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's still so so fascinating, and there is not a lot of information that is readily available about that too, I assume. I wondered, in listening to you, I really want to know what you said to your mother when she was struggling with the guilt that she later felt, even after having 12 children, not bringing more. And, I just, out of curiosity, if you don't mind sharing.
We were in a weird setting at that point in time. So, mothers and daughters often have back and forth issues. And, yes. And sometimes maybe even particularly eldest daughters and mothers. And we were equally stubborn human beings. But as she was feeling guilty at that window of time, so I went briefly in my history, I came out as a lesbian at age 14 through 17. I had a girlfriend at 14. It was probably 17 before we had a label for it. We were just romantic friends at first. We didn't realize there were other people like us. And then I came out and I left home at 18 and went out as a lesbian. And then pretty much because of the era in which I graduated high school and the fact that the help wanted ads were sex segregated and all the jobs that women could get paid terribly, I ended up starving out. And so I stayed out for 4 years, but there were a lot of pressures. My whole high school, my Catholic high school, all the girls in my graduating class, with the exception of about 6 really bright people who went on to go to college and had taken a lot of higher math and science that I hadn't taken. Most of my fellow students married that summer. And there was a lot of pressure. My parents expected me to stay home till I married. Annually, the priest would walk into the grade school or high school classroom and ask the boys what they wanted to be in the grade school room, and never ask the girls. And so then, year after year, a priest would turn to the girls and just sort of wave his hand and say, "You'll all be wives and mothers, unless, of course, you have a vocation to the convent." And I wanted to be a priest, but I didn't, and they still don't want me. And so I found a way to get ordained. The way that the place that would ordain me, with my lack of education and my inability to go to seminary and to pay for seminary, ended up being the non-denominational Pentecostal route, where they were non-denominational, but there was a sort of stream where they'd been ordaining women for about 100 years. And so while they expected me to be my husband's adjunct more than the senior pastor, I functioned as the senior pastor. But anyway, I took that ordination. And so at the time my mother is coming to me with that, we're actually having this Protestant Catholic divide. And she had used birth control and then, gone on happily. And somewhere somewhere they'd gotten into a kind of revitalized Catholic anti-birth control group that was meeting in Steubenville, Ohio, as I recall. And so my father and mother were going for annual retreats and in their 60s to Steubenville, Ohio. And so she was coming back with us. So I was having a pro-birth control, you know, and I was like, you know, Mom, really, like, you know, we're all in our 40s, like, you know, like we're pretty much past our reproductive windows anyway. Like, it really wouldn't be wise to keep having babies at this point. But yeah, so, but there was that Catholic guilt, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so what kinds of other resistance or what kinds of other traits have you had to contend with being of faith, and I'm assuming largely in your friends and your family, obviously of faith. How do you have these conversations? How do you?
Well, so when my sister challenged me about what the Bible said about homosexuality, and then I came back out to myself as lesbian, somewhere along that path, I became post-Christian. So I myself now identify as interfaith. Yeah, actually, part of it's about I had married a Jewish man. My daughter was taking Holocaust and genocide studies. We were having deep, deep conversations about commands to genocide in the text, and I reached a point where I could no longer intellectually be a scriptural literalist, which was required within that brand of Pentecostalism. So I left it. And they would have kicked me out anyway. They would have revoked their version of my ordination at that point in time. So I also then left my husband and you know, moved back into lesbian land. So yeah, but conversations about from a position of faith. So Protestantism as a whole, including even evangelicals, have generally accepted contraception. The warfare has all been around the concept that the moment the sperm penetrates the egg, God creates a human soul. And so even though, you know, it's simply this fertilized, what is it right then? Is it even a zygote? But that fertilized cell is just to them human. And so this fight for the life of this fertilized egg, and as opposed to the life of the adult woman. I think the next part of my journey was when I came back out, I returned to college as part of, you know, coming out and leaving my marriage and you know, switching my faith and going through those changes. I went to college and I had some really excellent women instructors. I went to Stockton and I did my women's studies certificate before I got around to doing my majors. And a woman by the name of Marilyn Vito, a professor by the name of Nancy Ashton. They taught these wonderful classes. And Marilyn Vito's daughter was at some level of hierarchy in NARAL at one point. But they caused me to see through data that women had always had the same number of abortions proportional to the population at any given time and space in human history, to the best of our statistical calculations, that reducing abortions making abortion illegal did not make the number of abortions lower. It just made the women much less safe and much more likely to die. And that the anti-choice movement has a strong, it will support a woman until, you know, they give her a bag of diapers and a crib, but then, you know, you're on your own for 18 more years and there's no accounting for what it does to your body and all those choices. I also had to face the fact that I had been, one of the pieces of data that came through the literature was that most anti-choice women were women of a given age bracket, were married, were like in that reproductive window, and they could imagine squeezing in another baby if one happened unplanned. And I realized I had been in that window when I was opposed to abortion. I had been married, and if we'd have had another child, it would have made things tight, but we would have managed. And so I had to admit I had been pro-abortion or pro-choice when I was a 14-year-old before Roe versus Wade. And so through my high school years, even though I really wasn't sleeping with boys, I was sleeping with a girl, but through my high school years, there was just always that fear of pregnancy. And I graduated high school in 1971, so 2 years before Roe. And in that time, we would tell stories about coat hangers or trying to fall downstairs, or, you know, what do you do if you end up pregnant and in trouble? We lost a lot of girls to pregnancy, because when you got pregnant as a teenager in a Catholic high school at the time, at least in my Catholic high school, you couldn't come back. You had to then go to the public school. And so you were shunned and shamed forever. And so I'd lost friends to their pregnancies. And so I'd been pro-choice, and then I'd been anti-choice. And then as I was coming out, and I'm now 45 years old and taking undergraduate classes, and it was like, if I got pregnant now, this would completely derail my life. I don't need to be pregnant at 45, giving birth at 46 or 47. I'd have to drop out of college. And it was at that point, I was moving forward. And so I had to realize like how many people are judging these issues from what they can conceive of in their own life and not thinking about the cost of what something is to others.
Sure.
Yeah.
I really wanted to touch on also having this time where you were in the faith and now you are in academia and you are a professor yourself, and seeing this next generation and how they do have this tool, but are they using it? Are they informed? Are we doing a good enough job as a society and, progressive medicine in sharing the information and in actually helping females have the autonomy? And what are your thoughts on that?
So some of my undergraduates, there are some that are just amazingly informed and wonderful in those regards, but it gets weird. So I teach. So I ended up doing a PhD in sociology. I did an undergraduate anthropology and sociology, and then I went on, I focused on race and ethnicity and gender and sexuality. And so at Rowan, as a lecturer, I'm teaching sexuality and society and sociology of women. I've taught sociology of the family. I've taught a number of human sexuality courses across time. And it's actually pretty frightening, the number of students in a human sexuality class who, when we get to the topic of birth control, will, one, note their fear of hormones, and two, are the disdain for condoms at present, whether that's mostly the male students or the female students' boyfriends or whatever that looks like in gender configurations. But there's a whole lot of using withdrawal, according to my students. And I end up term by term saying, do you want to finish your degree? Like, this is really not smart, Withdrawal is certainly better than nothing. And I forget off the top, I have the effectiveness rate, I believe, in my book, because I looked it up from Planned Parenthood's website. But I think it's somewhere in the 80th percentile. But it's, it is nowhere near as good as a condom and spermicide. And it's certainly nowhere near what hormonal birth control methods provide as far as efficacy. And so, and I point out to them, there's the possibility of live semen in pre-ejaculate fluid, but there's also, so one of the other things I do is I have a counseling practice, as I began as a minister back in the day, and I continue to have a spiritual interfaith counseling practice. But I know a number of women across time who have come to the point where they recognized a male partner as abusive and have decided to pull back away from him, and they're, talking about breaking up with him, and the next thing I know, they're pregnant, and their primary birth control method was withdrawal, and he was so good at it. He was just so reliable, and then all of a sudden, when he felt her pulling away emotionally, he just oops, I'm sorry. And then, oops, I'm sorry again. And we always had breakup sex. So, oops, I'm sorry again. And so I know a number of babies who have been conceived at that moment in time. Some of them that were carried to term and some not, or, some people didn't carry it into being a baby. But there is just that, I also think it's unreasonable. I mean, I don't have the experience of having a male body, at least in this lifetime. And so I'm presuming at some level based on my own experience, but we do have the same sex-specific nerve endings in our differential organs. And so I'm imagining that it's one of the most difficult things in the world, that it's a real feat to be able to stop just when it feels best and to do something else at that moment. So I think we ask a whole lot of guys when we ask them to withdraw. And so I encourage my undergraduates to seek real birth control and to not think of withdrawal as birth control.
Well, we are coming up at the half-hour mark. I do want to give you time to speak about anything else. Your life story is fascinating, and I have to thank you again for taking the time and being with us today to share it. Any recommendations you might have, or or hopeful thoughts for us coming in during this time would be a nice way to end. But any remarks you would like to give?
Well, vote and make sure you vote and plan your vote and vote in advance, vote early. But also, I think young women really don't know as much as they should. They're not getting sex ed they're not getting good sex ed often at the middle school or high school level. George W. Bush had funded, abstinence-only education. Obama, of course, changed that, but now Trump changed it back. So I'm again getting students who've had abstinence-only education. And so I find they really don't know a lot about how to prevent pregnancy. So they need that information. One of the most shocking pieces of information that they gain out of my book when I teach that is the fact that overwhelmingly convicted stranger rapists have paternal rights in our family court systems. And I don't think anybody realizes, like when people are busy being anti-choice, I don't think they recognize and think through what that means and why we have judges that would make those rulings, why those laws allow that, that whole something. So I think there's a lot of lack of information and misinformation. I think we need, as a movement, I think we are careful, but I think the news media is not careful. The conversation about fetal heartbeat laws, when they're telling you you're 6 weeks pregnant and really you only conceived 4 weeks ago because they're counting from your last period, which presumably was about 14 days before you ovulated. And so they're including those in and they're, talking about this when organs aren't really formed yet or fully formed. And so I think that, and so the calling it a fetus when it's not a fetus, when it's still on the cusp of being an embryo, or wherever it's exactly at 6 weeks or 8 weeks, what they're calling 6 or 8 weeks, which is 4 to 6 weeks after actual gestation. So I think that we need to hold others and ourselves as much as possible, and you see me struggling with it, but to hold ourselves to real, to be really precise in our language, and if possible, not to let those who are leading the conversation get away with calling the product of conception at 6 or 8 weeks a fetus, and talking about a heart when there's a pulsing vein. And so I think those kinds of things really matter, just being precise with our language and getting the information out there, because they don't have it. They really, I've got college students, right? So they're educated at some level, but they really don't know these things.
Well, always more work to be done. I put your website as a place to learn more about you. Is that also where we can find your book?
My book's on Amazon.
Or on Amazon? Okay,
yeah.
wonderful.
And you, for some reason with Amazon, you used to just be able to type Sullivan or the Rosechild. Now you have to type the whole thing, Nadine Rosechild-Sullivan. And I don't know why they're being that way. But, and I'm having students, it's recently published, but I'm having students who are like telling me whether or not they can access the paper copy and whether or not they can access the Kindle version, but I'm able to access both. So I think it's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And my other books are there too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And thank you again.
And hopefully very soon, having gotten all the states to ratify the ERA, hopefully that gets carried the rest of the way forward into actually being enshrined in the Constitution.
Yeah. Yes. And again, vote.
And again, thank you to the Alice Paul Institute. Thank you for everybody and for all that you're doing.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you.